So that obviously refers to our global democratic two-party states wherever we have, you see it in the U.S. right now. Of course, everybody's saying, well, it doesn't matter all of Hillary Clinton's fault. She's way less evil than Donald Trump. But I'm going to put this in the context of economics.
All right, let's put that into the context of economics.
We're going to go to this headline in a bit, but first I want to show you the death of neoliberalism and the crisis in Western politics. So the crisis that we're having in Western politics comes from the economics that we live within. So a lot of people prefer to have their news compartmentalized, politics here, and then economics and finance here. They don't like the two to merge. I think a lot of the powerful, our politicians, like you to have it that way, but we're going to look at how they combine. So let's look at the symptoms of the collapse, this death of neoliberalism, as Martin Jacques calls it. This is a tweet from Linda Yeo, and she says 57% of Americans are dissatisfied with choice between hashtag Clinton and hashtag Trump. 1/3 would consider third-party candidates. So we have everybody telling you that vote for the lesser of the two evils, but when in fact 57% of the American voter population, 57%, hate both of the candidates.
Yeah, that's right, because they both are representing something of a dying model. The only candidate out there, any political party, that represents really something that is a radical departure from a failing neoliberal catastrophe is Jeremy Corbyn. Okay, Jeremy Corbyn here in the UK.
We're going to go on to the neoliberal story from Martin Jacques. He actually says that Donald Trump is actually a break from neoliberalism in some ways. He is a throwback to the past, obviously, but also Hillary Clinton is the epitome, the ultimate of neoliberalism. But in terms of just the media's role in this, in presenting these lesser of two evils, that this is how they continue and propagate. It's like how a virus or a parasite survives, is they convince you to help them survive. So American journalism is collapsing before our eyes. This is in the New York Post, and the guy who wrote this was also started at the New York Times. Donald Trump may or may not fix his campaign, and Hillary Clinton may or may not become the first female president, but something else happening before our eyes is almost as important: the complete collapse of American journalism as we know it. The frenzy to bury Trump is not limited to the Clinton campaign and the Obama White House. They are working hand in hand with what was considered the cream of the nation's news organization. The shameful display of naked partisanship by the elite media is unlike anything seen in modern America. Now, he talks about, okay, yeah, there might be a liberal bias in most of the media, certainly the print media. He himself started at the New York Times during the Vietnam War era. And he said, certainly we were all left-wing, we were all against the war, just like all of our young compatriots out there in the streets fighting, protesting and stuff like that. But their editor, who was left-wing, made sure that at least in the editorial pages and the opinion pages, you could have whatever opinion you wanted, but in the front page that he would balance it with a more right-wing view to balance out the left-wing view of all the writers being against the Vietnam War, for example.
Right, well, you have this ticking time bomb phenomenon that was ushered in now in this era of terrorism, where, like, the New York Times, as a journalist, feels that they have a job above and beyond being journalists. That if they are charged with spreading propaganda on behalf of the U.S. government, because there's a ticking time bomb out there, and it could save one life, they have abdicated their role as journalists. And we saw that during the Bush era, famously leading up to the election. They hid a lot of stories about spying that Bush was involved with, because they felt that they had a responsibility other than the responsibility of being journalists. And then this transmutes into outright propaganda, and then you have a business model based on propaganda. But when you talk about economic and politics, you had the economic collapse of the 2008 period. Remember when they said that there were no victims, it's a victimless crime and you bail out all these banks. Well, just because the victims took 8 or 9 or 10 years to manifest doesn't mean it's a victimless crime. Now we're seeing a political collapse due to a financial collapse that was covered over in a way that created wealth and income gaps that gave rise to Black Lives Matter and rioting all over the country and insurrections around the world, and people are becoming embroiled in violent insurrections because of the inability of neoliberalism to address the fundamental problem that led to the collapse of 2008, which is that the banks are not in any way exposed to the risks that they are exposing everyone else to. They're insulated.
So last week or the week before, Hillary Clinton announced that her transition team would be headed by Ken Salazar. Ken Salazar is very, very linked with fracking, with TPP, with these trade deals. He is, the epitome of neoliberalism. She goes out on the campaign trail, and of course voters don't want that, so she promises them she's not going to have fracking or trade deals, signing the TPP. And yet she's appointing a guy who hires her entire staff. So the questions were not asked of her, however, because of the failure of American journalism. A recent article by New York Times media reporter Jim Ruttenberg, whom I know and like, began this way: if you're a working journalist and you believe that Donald J. Trump is a demagogue playing to the nation's worst racist and nationalistic tendencies, that he cozies up to anti-American dictators, and that he would be dangerous with control of the United States nuclear codes, how the heck are you supposed to cover him? So they cover him by not covering Hillary Clinton. And for example, he would never point out, speaking of dictators, that the Clinton Foundation has received billions of dollars from the Saudi regime, who are now carpet bombing Yemen. They never will bring that up. They will never. The American population has no idea that the war in Yemen is even happening. They have no idea that over half of the population of children are starving right now.
Right, well, this lesser of two evils concept, I mean, there's a corollary to that, which is this ticking time bomb, this Jack Bauer 24-hour phenomenon, where Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or George W. Bush are presented with this choice: either accept all of these reforms written by banks for banks, written by pharmaceutical companies for pharmaceutical companies, written by agricultural companies like Monsanto for Monsanto, or this mountain of quadrillion of debt is going to explode, the economy is going to implode, and it's all going to be on your watch. I mean, the world should do an Iceland. Maybe, Donald Trump could do an Iceland. Basically, it's a scorched earth policy. Essentially, burn down the house and rebuild from scratch. And what the healthiest thing that could possibly happen is for American economy to basically collapse. And we'd see who's really an entrepreneur and who's not an entrepreneur. I think America would rebuild itself.
So going back to that headline, The Death of Neoliberalism and the Crisis of Western Politics, he points out that before we had neoliberalism brought in the late 70s, early 80s, we had social democracies. You had social welfare states, even in America, and you got rid of most of that. It should be noted that by historical standards, the neoliberal era has not had a particularly good track record. The most dynamic period of post-war Western growth was that between the end of the war and the early 70s, the era of welfare capitalism and Keynesianism, when the growth rate was double that of the neoliberal period from 1980 to the present. So going back to the 1970s, just like the previous article was talking about during the New York Times, they had more honest journalism in that they had a balance. Before the neoliberal era, we had the gold standard, which provided some balance to not only the workers understood how much they were being paid, but the rest of the world knew how much they were being defrauded through trade. Now that brings me to trade deals and what Martin Jacques says about the one positive bit of Donald Trump's otherwise racist, as he points out, and nationalist his platform. He talks about the economic nationalism. But he says on the political front, as a country in decline, Trump argues that America can no longer afford to carry this kind of financial burden of financing all of NATO and all these trade deals and blah, blah, blah. Rather than putting the world to rights, he believes the money should be invested at home, pointing to the dilapidated state of America's infrastructure. Trump's position represents a major critique of America as the world's hegemon. His arguments mark a radical break with the neoliberal hyper-globalization ideology that has reigned since the early 1980s, and that's probably a U.S. military helicopter flying overhead, afraid we're talking about their hegemony ending, and with the foreign policy orthodoxy of most of the post-war period. These arguments must be taken seriously. They should not be lightly dismissed just because of their authorship. So again, here he's saying, Martin Jacques is saying, Trump is actually bringing up a really, really crucial point that is never allowed to be uttered on U.S. television, which is that the U.S. is at the end, we're no longer a hegemon, and we should stop trying to build the world in our image and take care of ourselves. But the media is only focused on, you know, partly because of him, like he keeps on tweeting stupid stuff, but they're not even like trying to provide some balance to their otherwise raw, naked dislike